Good afternoon, everybody. Glad you all made it down here to another beautiful room in this fabulous setting in Georgetown University. My name is Suzanne Lynch, and I'm the US correspondent for the Irish Times newspaper based here in DC. So, busy time for journalists, as you can imagine. No shortage of things to write about. And I know a lot of you were probably at the last session. There's going to be, a very different perspective. It was fantastic, the last session, I thought, the three contributors about their own experiences in Northern Ireland. Now we're going to look a bit more to the future and some of the political challenges that are happening now in Northern Ireland. I'm going to briefly introduce our four panellists. So on my far right, we've Norman Houston. He's the director of the Northern Ireland Bureau in Washington, essentially the Northern Ireland Embassy, if you'd like to call it that, even though it's not. Very experienced, 38 years in the Northern Ireland Civil Service, including 13 years working in a diplomatic role. And he has been responsible for Northern Ireland's relationship with North America since 2007. So great to have Norman here. On my right is Michael Lonergan. He's the Deputy Ambassador of Ireland to the US. He's held various positions both in Dublin and further afield for the Department of Foreign Affairs. He was head of the Consulate General of Ireland in Boston and was also previously Vice Consul in Edinburgh in Scotland. On my left, we have Michael Tatum. He has been the Deputy Ambassador of the United Kingdom here in Washington since January. Again, he's got a long career, illustrious career in the British Foreign Office, working in particular around the Balkans area. He was ambassador to Bosnia and Herzegovina, and obviously issues of conflict resolution in that part of the world were obviously paramount, and he's also worked at the UK mission to the UN in New York. And then finally on my far left we have Robert Fauché, and he's director of the Office of Western European Affairs within the US State Department. He's served in various US embassies around the world, including in Dublin and in Brussels and Luxembourg, and he's also been Deputy Director for EU Affairs in the State Department. So that's our panel, and the format of this is going to be Q&A. We're going to hopefully get a good discussion going here and then open it out to the floor. So just to begin, I just think it's worth reflecting on the fact we're 20 years on from the Good Friday Agreement, and yet by a quirk of, some would say, fate, I suppose, Northern Ireland has emerged as a problem area, if you like, in the last year or so. With two developments, really. One has been Brexit, and that has pushed Northern Ireland back onto the political consciousness in a big way, both in Europe and here in the US, 20 years on from the Good Friday Agreement. And in a sense, potential instability, political instability, if you like, in Northern Ireland has become the unintended consequence of Britain's decision to leave the European Union almost 2 years ago now, believe it or not. And it has emerged as one of the major, really fundamental sticking points of the Brexit negotiations, to an extent that no one really saw would happen. I myself was in Brussels. I was previously the Europe correspondent for a paper based in Brussels and was there during the British referendum. And like everybody else, witnessed the shock result. I remember being with all the British officials from the European Commission that evening when the result came through. But we do need to remember that no one saw the Northern Ireland issue becoming as much of an issue as it has done. So that's number one. And number two has been the lack of a power-sharing executive in Northern Ireland for more than a year now. Again, that's something that's become more and more serious in the last few months. And really there doesn't seem to be any sign of any kind of breakthrough. It might be something that we get into in this panel discussion. So in a lot of ways, Northern Ireland, for those two reasons, has, as I say, kind of been really thrust into the spotlight. And it's ironic that that has coincided with the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. But before we get into talking about that more, those challenges, if you like, and not to be too pessimistic, I suppose maybe we'll start off by looking at people's reflections on where we are now 20 years on from the Good Friday Agreement. And even though somebody mentioned to me before, it's a very interesting, when we look back at the long arc of history, 20 years in one way seems such a long time, but it's only a speck when you look back over decades, over centuries sometimes. and how are we going to remember? How will this be remembered in the future? So maybe I'll start with Norman, who is the only person from Northern Ireland, actually, out of all of us. So Norman, I mean, it's a big question, but I mean, you have been working for nearly 40 years for the Northern Ireland Executive. What do you see, did you ever imagine the kind of change that you witnessed over the last 20 years, or what have been the main achievements, do you think?
Well, thank you, Suzanne. I mean, I have been very fortunate in my career because I'm basically a Northern Ireland civil servant. I'm not a diplomat by profession, but I came here in 1998 to work in the Northern Ireland Bureau just after the Good Friday Agreement had been signed, and there was a tremendous sense of jubilation here in the United States because so much of the work in making the agreement stick came from the Clinton administration at that stage, and obviously more personally from Senator Mitchell. But there was still at that stage, back in Northern Ireland, a lot of concern that this deal would actually work because it required a number of enormous changes to how we perceived ourselves or how we were going to interact with ourselves from that date on, not least the release of prisoners from our prison system who had been convicted of crime. There was a release system under a licensing agreement. We were going to completely revolutionise and change the Royal Ulster Constabulary, which had been the police force since the formation of the state in 1921, to the Police Service of Northern Ireland. We had, with the Irish government, changes to Articles 1 and 2 of the Constitution of Ireland. And we had, believe it or not, to share power with people that we wouldn't necessarily have agreed with politically. So all those sorts of machinations were going around at that stage, and people probably thought this wasn't going to work. And leaving aside the two big elephants in the room at the minute, which is obviously the Brexit issue and the border and the lack of a functioning executive in Northern Ireland, I do think it is important that we look at where we've come to in that 20-year journey. I mean, just yesterday, Richard Ramsay, who is the chief economist at the Northern Bank in Belfast, declared that Northern Ireland now had zero unemployment. We had full employment because we had 3.5% unemployment, which in economist terms actually means you've got full employment. I mean, in 1998, if you had said that to someone, they just would have dismissed it as an impossibility. And of course, what happens is political stability does make an enormous change to the attractiveness of a region like Northern Ireland to bring inward investment in. Even if you look at America alone, we have 190 companies employing 23,000 people, and we export just over $3 billion worth of goods to this massive country every year. All those things are possible because for once, irrespective of the political shenanigans at the minute, we have the stability to allow that to happen. We also shouldn't miss the fact that, we're 20 years into the agreement, and a lot of young people who were very young at that stage have grown up without any spectre of violence in their lives. But those people themselves are now in their 20s and are now having children of their own. So we're having a second generation in Northern Ireland that's been brought up without the spectre of violence in their lives. And I don't think we should reflect on that and the difference it makes. And I do think, anecdotally, that the sort of binary combination of whether you're unionist or nationalist, particularly in the younger community, is not what it was before. And I'm really sorry I missed the earlier discussion with some of the young people here because I flew in from Chicago. But I think that from what I gather, that reflected that much more positive, forward-looking aspect of Northern Ireland. So I do think that the place that I grew up in, and I'm a much older person, is a very different place than people are growing up now. And the Good Friday Agreement was the basis for that. And I don't think, whatever we might reflect on Brexit and the lack of an assembly, which are enormous challenges, we need to see the positive side as well.
Yeah. Michael, maybe you'd reflect a bit about relations between the Irish and British governments and how that played out in the last 20 years. Like, it really was a feat of collaboration between those two governments that had a very difficult history for so long.
Yes, thank you. It's great to be here. It's very brave to put four diplomats on a panel because somebody once said a diplomat is always halfway between the banality and the cliche, or an indiscretion. So I'll try and avoid those three all three pitfalls. It's an interesting question because I'm afraid, not tell you something you already know. I mean, obviously, relations at the moment between Dublin and London are probably at a lower ebb than they have been for the previous years. And relations between Dublin and Belfast are at a more difficult time than they've been for some time. In fact, it's ironic, as a result of Brexit, the relations between Dublin and Edinburgh and Dublin and Cardiff are probably a good deal warmer than they are with either city and London or Dublin. And this is unfortunate, because one of the stories of the progress made in Northern Ireland was that when Dublin and London were in lockstep, working closely together, things happened. And when they weren't, and when we got into megaphone diplomacy and so on, and the personal relationship, for example, between Gareth Fitzgerald and Margaret Thatcher is what made the Anglo-Irish Agreement possible. The personal relationship between Bertie Ahern and Tony Blair and Bill Clinton was hugely important. And when you saw them in Belfast last week, I think the affection and the friendship was very obvious. And when you read Tony Blair's memoirs, for example, I mean, it jumps off the page, the kind of sense of trust and relationship that he and Bertie Ahern managed to establish. And with Albert Reynolds and John Major, who's often forgotten, but was a key figure in this. So it is unfortunate that at the moment we don't seem to have that kind of personal chemistry, largely I think as a result of the uncertainty caused by Brexit. And, you know, I know there are people, you know, in the British media particularly, who feel that we are not being sufficiently helpful and supportive. I mean, I think the view that our government would take is that it's very difficult to be helpful and supportive of London when we're not really clear what London actually see the end Brexit scenario being, because nobody wants a more seamless exit and a solid relationship than ourselves, because at the end of the day, even when the UK leaves the common market and the customs union, it will still be our biggest or second biggest export market in the world. We will still be Britain's fifth biggest export market in the world. We are tied by relations of kith and kin. There isn't a family in Ireland that doesn't have relations and family to Britain and so on. So even just leaving aside the Northern Ireland aspect and the border, just the relationship between Ireland and Britain, Dublin is an important one. And I have no doubt that as we get closer to closing the various chapters of Brexit negotiations, and as decisions get made, things will get back to a more even keel, because
the moment of tension now.
The dynamic will, it will, like all these things, it will probably get a little bit worse, and then hopefully we'll get a lot better. And in fairness to the Michel Barnier and to David Davis, I mean, a lot of progress has been made on some very, very difficult issues. But you are, of course, right. I mean, the issue with Northern Ireland on the border remains one that overshadows everything. And as you're aware, we have negotiated this backstop, which is that if we are unable to agree any more terms, the border will remain as it is today, i.e. no border. So in that sense, at least, there is some certainty of that is one scenario. But again, that causes other issues.
Thanks. And just this idea of collaboration between the British and Irish government, I saw just this week that the Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, actually suggested to his party that maybe the British and Irish cabinets could meet regularly after Britain leaves the EU, and France and Germany seemingly do that. First of all, that seemed like a strange proposal, but I didn't realise France and Germany do that, because the idea is that one of the many challenges is that Britain and Ireland have been so closely aligned on most issues of the European Union, and they've backed each other up, and they've agreed, they'd be much more pro-trade and pro-business together, that Ireland is losing a major ally in Europe now. And meeting in Brussels allowed the British and Irish governments to another forum for dialogue. So it'll be, as you say, maybe there will be a move to kind of really double down on relationship building after Brexit, when we're in this new relationship. Michael, and before we get into Brexit, because I do want to talk about that in detail, just I suppose to be a bit more positive about it, I mean, in your own experience, do you think that the Good Friday Agreement, I mean, is the government, for example, one of the issues that's come up in the recent months is that certain politicians have said maybe the Good Friday Agreement has run its course. You know, maybe it's time to accept its limitations. Or how does the British government or British people, I suppose, feel about the achievements in Northern Ireland? Are they proud of the Good Friday Agreement? What has been the main achievement over the last 20 years?
Yeah, let me say at the outset that you've cited some people who have talked about the Good Friday Agreement running its course or not being fit for purpose. I can't remember the exact phrase, but that is emphatically not the position of the British government. The British government remains totally committed to the Belfast Agreement, to the Good Friday Agreement. I think there is still in the UK a sense that this was a remarkable achievement by the politicians of Northern Ireland and by the British and Irish governments. And exactly as Norman has said, it has provided the context for what I think has been the remarkably positive experience of Northern Ireland in the last 20 years. The fact that its economy has grown substantially, that it's become a centre for investment, a place where technological innovation is happening, a broadcasting centre. I speak from experience because my wife, who works in television, works for a TV production company that has established itself in Belfast. So I get these kind of first-hand accounts from her of what a kind of vibrant, trendy, hip town Belfast is. So to be clear, I think that the Good Friday Agreement is a fantastic achievement. I'm not an objective observer on this because for 3 years of my diplomatic career, I was working in Downing Street during the Tony Blair's period as Prime Minister, and in a very, very minor role, I was involved in work on the Northern Ireland peace process, and I still feel, despite the fact that it was a very minor role, I still feel very proud to have been associated with that achievement. The other perspective that I have on the Good Friday Agreement is a sort of broader diplomatic one. I spent 4 years working in our mission to the United Nations in New York, dealing with a whole range of conflicts that just seemed intractable, that seemed fated to persist, that seemed rooted in sort of centuries or decades of tension and hatred. I worked in the Western Balkans as ambassador to Sarajevo, and again, I think I have the sort of perspective of all that sort of commentary in the 1990s of sort of despair and you know, is there just nothing you can do? And I think the power of the Good Friday Agreement is it shows that even where you have a situation of protracted conflict and deeply rooted division, you can make progress. And that progress brings clear benefits to the people concerned. But it also sends a very powerful signal to the world. It provides a wider example that with real determined political effort, with politicians who are ready to really stick to the task, to be imaginative, to take risks, you can achieve big results that pay substantial dividends.
Great, thank you. Robert, your thoughts on, I mean, has Northern Ireland fallen off the agenda really for the US State Department, for the United States? Or maybe has it become more about, you know, economic relations between Ireland and Britain and America really? Is that more the focus now? Or maybe you'd reflect on how things have changed.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me here today. And I have to say, the United States has been committed to Northern Ireland and to what's going on in Ireland for years, for decades. And it continues to be so. And with the changes with the Good Friday Agreement, what we saw was that things developed positively in Northern Ireland. And this positive developments led to stability, which led to prosperity. And right now, we estimate we have about 195 companies invested in Northern Ireland, creating about, I think it's 20,000 jobs there. Northern Ireland is, the United States is now the biggest investor in Northern Ireland, and I think we're the second market for Northern Ireland goods. So there's a large economic and commercial component to the relationship, but that doesn't sum it up. When you talk to people on the Hill, when you talk to the average American, they look at the Good Friday Agreement as one of the lasting, most important agreements and achievements of the 20th century. They are amazed at what was done there, and they're amazed at the inspiration it has provided to peoples around the world. And I think most Americans are very proud of the American role in helping achieve the Good Friday Agreement. And it's for that reason that the United States government, through our consulate in Belfast, has remained extremely committed to trying to see this through, to try to help where we can, the parties come together, reconcile, and move forward and make progress. I think on the Good Friday Agreement, what we saw since it was agreed was, you know, incredible progress on really, really tough issues. Things that were, you know, progress on things that were almost unimaginable, say 30 years ago. And still, the job is not done. And there's still more that needs to be done, even though the issues I don't think are quite the same quantum of magnitude that they were then. There are still things that have to be addressed. And the United States has remained committed to working with the parties, with the co-guarantee countries, with everyone to see what we can do to move things forward. So I would say Northern Ireland remains on our political agenda, on our diplomatic agenda, and our economic commercial agenda. And I would say, add one other thing on that. And about a month ago, we had the St. Patrick's Day celebrations at the White House. And we had the Taoiseach there with many Irish officials. But we also had a large component of people from the civil society and businesses from Northern Ireland who were invited. And they came and attended. And I think everybody felt a sense of disappointment that we didn't have political leadership there, because we don't have an executive in Northern Ireland. And that's what we're working toward, trying to kind of reconvene and move forward, and hopefully continue forward with the institutions that the Good Friday Agreement had intended to go forward, especially as we come to the Brexit question, which I know we're going to get back to.
And just to ask, Rex Tillerson suggested that the possibility of appointing a US envoy to Northern Ireland, is that still on the agenda?
It's, well...
I know there's been a lot of other things preoccupying. How does Mike Pompeo feel about Northern Ireland?
We'll learn soon.
Yeah.
No, I think we were moving forward with various proposals on this. There was I think the congressman up on the Hill felt there was a need for someone to play the role that's been played in the past. That role has changed. Sometimes it's been more political, sometimes more economic, but there was a need for kind of a U.S. re-engagement with someone in that kind of thing, and that was being processed, let me put it that way. But of course, we're going through various transitions at the State Department, and so hopefully, when we get through these transitions, we'll be able to move forward on this.
North Korea, Iran, and then hopefully...
Well, I'm talking more personnel type changes.
Yeah, no, I know, yeah. Thank you for that. Let's talk about Brexit. And I suppose I'm conscious we have a mix of people in the room. This is a journalist in me, to make everything clear. But, just so people are aware, and I don't want to sound patronising about the issue with Brexit in Northern Ireland, really, I mean, I'm simplifying here, but there is an inherent conundrum now facing Britain and the European Union, because now Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom is leaving the European Union, and the Republic of Ireland is not. So how do you square that circle? Because the British government has said they want to leave the EU's customs union and the single market. And if you leave the customs union, it seems that the only way of solving that problem of trade over the border is to erect a border. Because ironically, Britain will now have a land border with the European Union. Now, the British government has said, the Irish government has said, no return to a hard border. We're going to have a frictionless border. But at the same time, they're saying they want to leave the customs union. So that seems to be a contradiction in terms, and we don't seem to have a solution for that yet. And it hasn't gone away as a problem. Michael, how concerned are the Irish government about this border issue? Maybe you could just explain to people, the seriousness of this issue, and what solution do you see?
I mean, again, to echo what everybody has said, I mean, I served in Belfast 2001, 2002. I mean, the transformation of Belfast in that time has been remarkable, and in Northern Ireland. One of the dividends of the 20 years of peace has been that the two economies on the island of Ireland have become much, much more integrated than they had been in the past. In fact, the economies, I think it might be fair to say, Norman, are more integrated than the people are at one level. And of course, this doesn't matter when you're all part of the same common market. So, for example, every morning, 300,000 gallons of milk come south to be processed in Northern Ireland. There is something like 220 different crossing points of the border. There's millions of journeys made every week back and forth and so on. Huge intertrade, companies' operations both sides of the border and so on. And this all becomes extremely complicated if you have to have a non-EU, EU type structure and setup. And nobody is quite sure. The other complicating factor in this is that the Good Friday Agreement, one of its great genius of it was the idea that it allowed people in Northern Ireland to decide they were British or Irish or both, which means every one of the 1.7 million people in Northern Ireland is entitled to citizenship of Ireland, which means every one of them is entitled to citizenship of the European Union. Yeah. So how does Brussels deal with 1.7 million people who are technically outside of the Union, but every one of which can opt for EU membership? And it's an open secret. Since Brexit took place, the business of Irish passports has been rocketing, and you would be surprised some of the people in Northern Ireland who have taken out an Irish passport just to be sure, as we would say back in Ireland. So this is definitely a very complicating factor, and it's the top priority. And in fairness, this is the top priority for the British government, for ourselves, and this I think is one of the great tragedies of the lack of an executive in Belfast, because while this extremely important debate is going on, the voice of Belfast isn't being heard the way it should be. And I think that is one of the single biggest drawbacks. So while these complicated negotiations are taking place in Brussels, who is there to shout and stand and fight for Northern Ireland's interests? Now, we obviously feel that we do that up to a point, but it would be far, far better if we had an executive with a First Minister, Deputy First Minister also making those points both in Brussels and in London and in Dublin. And there's no getting away from it. This is the single top political priority of the government, to solve this border issue, because it's vital to our own interests, but also for the long-term stability and protecting the hard-won gains of the peace process. Everybody agrees that going back to a border will only be a retrograde step. And in fairness, there isn't a single person advocating that in Northern Ireland of any political party. I mean, it's rare to get consensus in Northern Ireland by everybody, but on this issue, there largely is that nobody wants to return. And particularly hugely important parts of the Northern Ireland society and economy, and particularly of the farming community and so on, they're particularly against this, because they know the damage it would do to them both economically and potentially politically.
Michael, obvious question to you as a representative of the British government. What is the solution? Just today, I was just reading just before I came here that Donald Tusk, the head of the European Council, addressed the issue of Brexit today in the European Parliament, and again he outlined the need to get a solution for Northern Ireland and said it's up to Britain to come up with a solution, saying Britain decided to leave, it's their job to find solutions. So how is Britain going to square this circle?
Okay. I'm going to do the diplomat's trick of taking a step back, but I will come in, zoom in, and if I don't, feel free to
zoom me back.
Yeah. I hope I'm not going to sound too kind of Pollyanna-ish, but I'm determinedly optimistic about the way ahead. Partly because of my sense of what Brexit does and does not represent. What it does represent was the view of the majority of the UK public that they wanted a different relationship with the rest of the European Union. What it was not was Britain trying somehow to kind of leave Europe, which is geographically impossible. What it was not was the United Kingdom turning all introspective and turning in upon itself. We are resolved to remain very engaged with Europe and with the world. And what it definitely was not was about doing anything that would undo all of that amazing progress which Norman described a moment ago in Northern Ireland. To the contrary, all major British politicians are determined that progress and that the Good Friday Agreement that underpins it should be preserved at all costs. Now, I think it's fair to say that the European Union provided very important context for the close relationship between Ireland and the UK that fed into the Northern Ireland peace process and the Good Friday Agreement. I think we need to make sure that leaving the European Union does not undo that. We need to bank that progress and make sure that the Brexit arrangements allow the closeness to continue. Is that a challenging task? Probably it is going to be a challenging task. Is it an impossible task? I don't think so, and I certainly hope not. I think one of the challenges of Brexit is that it is a big, long, and complex process that has been playing out over months and has many more months, or several more months at least, of negotiations ahead. And we don't have all the answers to the many valid questions that people have. And we don't have those answers because those answers depend upon negotiations that are ongoing at the minute. When it comes to those negotiations, again, I'm broadly optimistic. And what I've observed over the last year or so is this, that at any one time, there's an enormous amount of kind of heat and breathless kind of media reporting about these negotiations, and we're always on the brink of a crisis, or breakdown is always imminent. I remember having to sort of address one group of business people about Brexit, and as I was in the car on my way down, I was scanning the media, and there was this big headline that said something like "Mount Brexit is about to blow," and it does all feel very fevered. When it comes down to it, sober, measured bureaucrats are engaging with each other in dreary offices in Brussels and broadly getting the business done. There have been 2 crunch points so far in this process. One was in December, the other was in the March European Council. In December, it was about the terms of withdrawal. In March, it was about the principles of an implementation period. You know, the negotiations were tough, but on both occasions, agreement was reached on schedule and with crucial provisions around the border that I think should give us some comfort. The British government has been totally clear that it will not allow a hard border to re-emerge between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. That is a clear commitment that the government has made and that it repeats in strong and emphatic terms on every occasion that it has the opportunity to do so. How will that how will a hard border be avoided, which was your question? I'm afraid I don't have the answer to that today, because that is going to be the outcome of negotiations that are ongoing. What the British government has said is that it hopes that the hard border can be avoided in the context of a comprehensive trade agreement between the UK and the EU. It is said that if that's not possible, it will offer other ideas, and in a recent speech, the Prime Minister sort of talked in at this stage, relatively conceptual terms about what those might be. But in any event, the language of the December communication between the UK and the EU is clear that there are no circumstances in which a hard border will reappear, and that's certainly a commitment that we are very serious about. In my experience, you get into difficulties either where there is no political will, or where there is political will amongst the relevant parties concerned, but it's a sort of different political will. It's a sort of political will for different aspirations. On this, the British government, I think you'll agree, Michael, that the Irish government, the political leaders in Northern Ireland are all clear that a hard border is what they do not want to see. And I think given that shared aspiration, I'm optimistic that even if I can't say right now how it's going to be achieved, that the negotiators will manage that.
I suppose one of the crunch points is really, though, that the Irish government and the EU want this solved now, essentially, and the British government, as you just said there, see the solution as part of the future trade relationship with the European Union. You know, whereas a lot of people on the Irish side believe that if they don't secure it in writing now, that it will be then used as a bargaining chip, obviously, later on in the process. Would that be right? I mean, so that's one of the issues. And I suppose the second thing, just to keep everyone in the picture, I suppose it's been said a lot that it's really the solution is technological. People are hoping that there'll be some kind of technology that will allow, number plates of trucks to be read electronically across the border. They're the kind of solutions. I'm going to come to Norman in a minute, but Michael, what do you say about?
There has been some mooting, I think, by the Foreign Secretary knows about this idea of that you could use technology to have a border that was virtual. To the best of our knowledge, this has not existed anywhere in the world. Now,
well, they do talk about Sweden and Norway, don't they?
Yeah, but that's different because, of course, Norway
in the
common market,
yeah.
but not in the customs union.
Yeah,
it's amazing how these things become. I mean, I must confess, I'd never heard of the customs union up until Brexit. I suspect most people hadn't, and now suddenly everybody's an expert on the customs union and the common market
I'm not.
and everything else. And this stuff becomes extremely tortuous at different times. But I think the whole point is that, I mean, the Taoiseach, when he was here in early March, went up to visit the Canadian-American border to see how that operates. And he made the point afterwards that it was very efficient and very effective, but it was a hard border, and that therefore it didn't offer the kind of solution that we want. But I think the point that Michael makes is very, very true. That we have to be, I think, hopeful, realistic. That if nobody in Northern Ireland wants it, Dublin doesn't want it, and London doesn't want it, that it won't happen. I think that has to be the jumping off point.
And the European Union is good at fudging and at the last minute coming up with a solution.
Indeed.
Norman, are you finding the Brexit challenge coming up, as I say, on the doorsteps here? But in terms of your your roles representing Northern Ireland, is it a concern for investors? Is it a serious concern for people?
Yeah, yes, well, it's particularly hard for me because I don't have an executive to represent, and as the other panel members have said, that the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union, but 55% of the population in Northern Ireland voted to stay. And if you look at the demographics, the people around the border, not surprisingly, were the ones that were most adamant that they wanted to remain part of the European Union. And just before the executive collapsed, the two ministers did write to the Prime Minister setting out their wish list, an agreed wish list for how a border might look like. And as Brian, as the two Michaels have said, when you don't have an executive there to be at the table with Mrs May when she's negotiating, it does make the thing more difficult. And in my job's more difficult as well because, unless you get a particular line from Belfast to say, this is what you've got to say, and this is all you're allowed to say, at least you have something. But at the minute, I'm sort of winging it a bit on this. And I know we're being recorded, which is even more worrying. But I just say a couple of things, and going back to the agreement again, one thing I didn't mention, which is very important, was that what the agreement also did was establish north-south bodies and indeed east-west bodies. But the north-south bodies, there were 12 in total, and not to go through them all because I can't remember what they all did, but two very significant ones were Tourism Ireland, which markets the island of Ireland around the world. Now, last year, 2016, we had 250,000 North Americans visiting Northern Ireland for the first time, holiday, whatever, spending $1.1 billion. The figures for 2017 suggest that that's up by 8%. So that body, which is, it's not just selling north, it's come to Ireland, but it includes the rest of the island. And obviously, before the Good Friday Agreement, a lot of Americans, for obvious reasons, were worried about their safety and wouldn't have come north. We have other bodies like animal health. I mean, you've got on an island with a 300-mile border, most of which is pasture land. People have cows, they have sheep, all sorts of things. So, the issues around animal health, should there be some terrible outbreak of foot and mouth or something like that, it's very hard to manage that if you're dealing with two completely different entities. I've just flown in this morning from Chicago, where I was helping to lead a trade mission for companies from Armagh, Portadown and Craigavon. And for all of you that know Northern Ireland, that's right on the border. And 3 of the people were in the food processing industry, and they kept saying, we have a lot of foreign workers. If you go to Moy Park in Dungannon or in Portadown, a very large number of the people working there now are Portuguese or Eastern European. And there was a worry with these people about, what happens. And even for the local Irish people, whatever you want to call them, Northern Irish or Southern Irish, whatever, a lot of people are travelling across the border every day to work. So if you're in Donegal, you're going into Derry and vice versa. And, if you are a cancer patient in Donegal, you're now treated in Altnagelvin. because it's such a long journey to get to Dublin. So there's all sorts. It's not just the economy bit, which Michael so eloquently talked about. It's also, there's a whole series of interactions now on health and things like that, on tourism, which people just don't know, I suppose, really what's going to happen. I do think that, you know, we will work out something, but it's very hard just to envisage what would work, you know, because in many cases, you know, do you have a border at every, you know, 250 crossings or something like that, a border representative? It just doesn't seem practical. I think that the governments will have to come up with some arrangement which is, you know, makes it work.
Yeah, and just what you touched on there, actually, Norman, just to kind of keep with you for a while. Look, the Northern Ireland Executive and where we are now, I mean, what's the solution to that? I mean, or where do you were talking, maybe you talk a bit more about, like, you know, even doing your job. Do you think it has, I think in the south of Ireland, we forget the material impact that's having on decision making in Northern Ireland and on people's lives in Northern Ireland. Are you concerned at this stage about the breakdown of relations?
Well, I suppose I've been so long on the tooth working in the Northern Ireland system that you're always very careful what you say about those things. All I would say is I've been in the civil service over 40 years, and I spent the majority of my career with direct rule, and then the last bit of it with devolved administration, obviously not since January 17 when it all collapsed. But having done the job as an executive diplomat, for want of a better word, it's a much better job to do, because there's nothing better to have your own ministers out here. I mean, if we had had an executive up and running, we would have had a meeting in the White House with the President. We would have ministers at the Speaker's lunch, would have been at the Irish Ambassador's event, the British Ambassador's event for the Secretary of State. So it's harder to keep the profile of Northern Ireland up when you're not bringing ministers out. And we do rely a lot more now on things like softer diplomacy, you know, where I'm seeing Matt Turney in the room, you know, doing things with theatre groups, bringing people in from, we had people in the other week from the PSNI, and they did a very good seminar about how policing had revolutionised in Northern Ireland and how it had now 90% buy-in from the population from both communities. So you have to keep doing things like that.
I mean, because like there's an argument now, you know, when does direct rule actually come back? Have we already slipped into a system where we are back at direct rule? Michael, what's the feeling in Dublin at headquarters about this?
Well, I mean, I think the official government position, of course, is that we are completely opposed to the reimposition of direct rule. And again, you know, I mean, to be fair to the last two secretaries of state, I mean, they have stretched this thing out and given the parties as much time as they require. The frustrating thing here is that at different times the parties have been extremely close to an agreement. In fact, at one stage, I mean, a few months ago, both the Taoiseach and the Prime Minister flew into Belfast, and we kind of thought we were there, and at the last minute the DUP got nervous and pulled out again. Look, it's obvious. I mean, the people of Northern Ireland should be governed by the people who live there.
But maybe your job as a government, the Irish and the British, is to now do something to try and bring these together. You know, there's been suggested about cutting the pay for some of these politicians.
Would you see?
There's the public are getting sick of this, going, why are we these guys? Or have we not reached that point yet?
You see, I mean, one of the problems in I think anywhere, but I think like a lot of places in Ireland and Northern Ireland particularly, some of these problems are a bit more magnified, is that by doing one thing, you create a ripple effect and you don't know where it's going to lead, and is it going to lead anywhere better? I mean, for the average member of the public in Northern Ireland, I'm sure it's quite annoying that the 90 members of the Assembly are still getting paid, having not sat for 15 months. But on the other hand, these are the politicians whose job it is to fix this. And if you cut their salaries and they lose their support staff and their special advisors, the ripple effect, is that going to create more instability or less? And you'd have to feel it's going to create more instability. I think the issue has got to be to continue, and this is what both governments are doing, and the US as well, is to continue to actively encourage the parties to sit down and solve this. And the really frustrating thing is that given, as Norman so well described, given some of the huge issues that we solved, like decommissioning, like police reform, like the prisoner releases, which were so difficult for so many people on both sides, to see people released who had committed most appalling atrocities. And we managed to find solutions and and move on these big issues. So what we're divided on right at the moment, and I don't want in any way diminish the importance of things like the Language Act and so on, but they're not in the same scale as police reform or decommissioning or prisoner releases, and we were able to jump those hurdles. So, but the problem is that the longer this goes on, the harder it is to put back together again. And that's was said at the time that Martin McGuinness pulled out, that we all said, look, we understand the politics of this, but if you walk out, how do you walk back in again? And that's where we are.
And of course, the other dynamic here is that the British government, the DUP, is propping up. Sorry, I was trying to think of a less pejorative term there, but the British government, I mean, Theresa May is depending on DUP support for her majority. So there would be a suspicion by some communities that, she's got the ear of the DUP too much, or what would you say to that, Michael? This whole interesting now relationship, the DUP is kind of calling the shots on so much.
I think the technical term for propping up is a confidence and supply agreement. There is a confidence and supply agreement between the Conservative Party and the DUP, which is about ensuring stability and continuity of government across the whole of the United Kingdom. That does not alter the DUP's influence on Northern Ireland issues, and it does not affect the government's objective approach towards its Northern Ireland responsibility. So that's what I would say on that, Suzanne. I very much agreed with what Michael said about the executive. The sooner that it is back up and running, the better. Our Secretary of State for Northern Ireland was over here recently. You interviewed her, Suzanne, and I sense real frustration on her part. She doesn't want to be passing budgets herself. She wants the politicians in Northern Ireland to be doing that. Exactly as Michael said, what we want to see is locally elected, democratically accountable government back in place in Northern Ireland. And we have gotten very close to that in the recent past, and I think that those efforts need to continue. My view is that the governments need to be in, I don't know quite, I think there's probably not just one word, but doing all of being facilitative, cajoling, encouraging, and chiding and empowering the Northern Ireland politicians to try and resolve these issues. But for me, I think stepping in has all the risks that you described, Michael. And I also agree that, if you look at the past and the real kind of vision, the difficult political decisions that were made on major issues, I think, sort of looking back and maybe drawing inspiration from that and being spurred on to show the same determination and vision on the issues that are currently causing the blockage would be really great.
Robert, just to kind of pick up on the opposite position, if you like, on the DUP issue, I thought it was very interesting this St. Patrick's Day. I interviewed Ian Paisley Jr. and there was actually a very big DUP presence here in Washington for St. Patrick's Day. And obviously one of the issues a lot of the unionist communities would have had with the American involvement over the years in Ireland would be that it's too pro-South, it's too pro-Catholic maybe. And he was making the point, Ian Paisley Jr., to me, that actually the DUP now with the Trump administration have a lot of links here now. And, I met all these DUP politicians who usually don't come here, but some of them knew Mike Pence personally, Trump administration. And I thought it was interesting that the Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, made a very strong point in an event to mark the Good Friday Agreement when he said he reached out, if you like, to Ulster Protestants and said, you've got so much Irish heritage in this country here, the Scots-Irish and all that, and maybe you need to reclaim that. But presumably, is that something, and that's a roundabout way of getting to my question, which is, in the issue of maybe appointing a Northern Ireland envoy, presumably it's difficult to get somebody that both communities are happy with, and that's not seen as too maybe pro-nationalist. Would that be the case, Robert? Or?
No, not at all. In the past, we've always had success in finding someone who can work with both parties. I mean, the United States, I think, is viewed as an honest broker in this process. Okay. And it doesn't come down on one side or the other. We're just trying to facilitate and help the parties find a way forward. And I think that's what we expect to be doing in the future. Yeah. So I don't think there's... there are certain names that would come up that one side or the other would say, no, that's not acceptable.
Yeah.
But I don't think those
That
names would
happens
really
anyway.
be the case.
Yeah.
And this has been true through all our administrations, both Democratic and Republican. And I think both sides have seen that the United States is there in a very supportive role and wants a good outcome for both parties, because that will be the lasting outcome. You can force something through and it won't last.
Yeah.
Both sides have to see that this is our future together, and this is the way we want to move forward. And that's what we're trying to help them to achieve.
Okay. I'm going to open up to questions in a minute, but just one last question, which again sounds provocative, but the idea, I'm going to ask you, Michael, but has Brexit made the idea of a united Ireland, brought that much closer? I think it's been very interesting that our Foreign Minister, Simon Coveney, said publicly recently, which irked a lot in the unionist community, that he envisaged seeing a united Ireland in his lifetime. He's in his early 40s.
Well, I would never disagree with my minister, of course. It would be fatal.
So that annoyed a lot of people in Northern Ireland.
I think myself, there's a certain irony in this, because certainly the first time in my lifetime, this issue of Irish unity is now to some extent on the agenda, but it has not been put on the agenda by the Irish government. I don't even think it's been put on the agenda by Sinn Féin, though they may try and take the credit. It's actually been put on the agenda, ironically, I think, by the Conservative and Unionist Party because of the whole fallout of Brexit, which has just changed the whole dynamic. I don't think it's particularly helpful. I think myself that when we talk about Northern Ireland, and I thought the discussion earlier, just before this, was really rich in this area. And we've actually done a lot of thinking about this ourselves in our own department. The missing bit in all of this, and it came across very strongly, I thought, in the conversation earlier, is the R word, reconciliation. That's what we should be talking about, not talking about unity in the island of Ireland. We should be talking about reconciliation between the two communities in Northern Ireland. Because if you don't have that, you're never going to have either a happy Northern Ireland, whether it remains part of the United Kingdom, or whether down the line it changes the constitutional status. That is all, to my mind, putting the cart away before the horse. But what we need is far more effort made on reconciliation between the two communities. And that's the job for everybody. It's a job for the political parties, it's a job for both governments, it's a job for civil society, it's a job for the churches, and everybody else's part to play. And it is true to say that after 20 years of the Good Friday Agreement, there just has not been enough progress made in that space. And the point made about integrated education and things like that really point to that. And there just still isn't enough cross-community initiatives and work and so on. And that's not to take away from the great work done by the National Fund for Ireland, the American Ireland Fund, Cooperation Ireland, a plethora of bodies who are in this space. But I mean, sometimes you see something happening in Northern Ireland and you realise how much mistrust there still is there. And it seems to me that the fairer way to look at that is that 20 years is very short. If you look at what preceded those 20 years, the 30 years before that, and the 100 years before that, we should maybe be less surprised that 20 years isn't long enough. And I often would make the point to Americans, the US Civil War is 160 years since it finished. And yet you can still find echoes of it in some parts of this country. And when people talk about moving a statue in Alabama or Louisiana, 160 years on, it's raw. So I think we need to give the people in Northern Ireland more time. And in the south of Ireland, we had a short but bitter civil war, and it took probably 80 years for the wounds to heal. But eventually they did heal. So I would much rather people talked about the need for more reconciliation rather than talking about the constitutional status. I think that would be more helpful. Okay,
that's a nice point to finish on. I'm going to open it up to the floor now. So, anyone with questions? Yes. Here we go. Now, I don't know. We were over mic here yet, and if you want to introduce yourself as well, please.
Sure. My name is Craig Blakely. My question is, we heard from the first panel today about the important role that the United States, specifically President Clinton and Senator Mitchell, played in the Good Friday Agreement. We heard the second panel from some of the younger people about the need to take the Good Friday Agreement to build on it, not just rest on it. And obviously there are ways in which it's deteriorating, the absence of a functioning executive, et cetera. My question is, to the extent, if you can sort of describe, if we got past the Brexit issue and the absence of a functioning executive, what's the next step sort of to build on the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland? And also, what role should the U.S. play in that? In spite of the assurances from the gentleman from the State Department, this administration has made very clear that the president is the only one who matters, as he says. And, you know, he's not a model of consistency. I mean, only recently he announced he was going to consider rejoining the TPP, and then this week thought about it again and decided not to. So, you know, and there obviously is no envoy to Northern Ireland yet, and there's not an envoy to South. Not
yeah,
yet.
we didn't bring that one up. Yeah, no, good point.
So the question is, how important, what's the next step? How important is the U.S. to that? And how important is the active involvement of the U.S. or the president of the U.S. to whatever the next step is to build on the Good Friday Agreement?
Norman, do you want to respond to
Yeah,
that?
well, I think Michael sort of encapsulated it earlier, Michael Longren, when he was talking about the lack of reconciliation. I mean, I mentioned earlier that we have now full employment in Northern Ireland, and we have, you know, our tourism is growing and all that sort of things. But fundamentally, the society has not healed, and we still have major divisions, particularly in areas which would be economically deprived. We did start some work just before the executive collapse called Together Building a United Community. And the idea was to bring school children together, some like the lovely summer camps that you have here for students where they go off and you know, spend time together. And that has worked, but fitfully it hasn't really worked in any great concerted way. And I think that is the issue. And you know, when I talked about the economy growing, which is very clear, we still have pockets in Northern Ireland of people who have not benefited from the peace process. And more probably needs to be done to target those areas in terms of educational attainment, inward investment, to cut down on that feeling of alienation. We still have in Northern Ireland a segregated school system. Michael touched on it very briefly. Only 8% of students in Northern Ireland go to integrated schools. By integrated, I mean Protestant and Catholics being educated together. The vast majority of our schooling system is segregated. And unless you end up at university, you're somewhat unlikely to meet someone from the other community. And it's also very much class related as well. You know, the less well off you are, the more likely you are to be in a segregated area. And that's particularly true in what you call them projects here, but we call them council houses. If you go to a council estate in Northern Ireland, by definition, it's either one or the other. So we haven't really been able to break that down. And I would imagine that an executive coming back in again, a priority would have to be trying to break down those barriers and make people feel less conscious of the other, because we still have peace walls in Northern Ireland, which is a euphemism, a strange euphemism, that we separate people by a brick wall. And we actually have more of those now than we did in the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, because communities have not felt the confidence or trust to remove those physical barriers. So I'd have said that would have been the biggest, along with continuing to build the economy. On the point of the Envoy, I've been lucky enough to work with quite a few of them over the years. But the last person to do the really big job was Paula Dobriansky under the Bush administration, because she was part of the State Department in a very senior position, and she had the imprimatur of the White House behind her. Other people have done it since and very well, but they just didn't have that strong negotiating aspect to their job. And even if their role wasn't that detailed, what it says to the people of Northern Ireland is that America still cares. And that they still have an interest, and I think we wouldn't want to lose that.
Yeah. So exactly,
I have to
come in.
respond to that a little bit. I mean, I joined the Foreign Service in 1985, and I've worked under a lot of different presidents, many of whom have been controversial and unpopular in various ways. And I have observed a lot of inconsistency, regardless of who's in the White House, and a lot of consistency. And what I would say is our commitment to Northern Ireland has been core. It's been bedrock, and it hasn't been changing through all the various changes of administrations that I've seen. The United States is with the Irish, with the Northern Irish, with the British in resolving this problem, and we're going to be there. And we will look for the best way of dealing with it. We have a consulate. We're one of the only countries with a consulate in Northern Ireland. There's no discussion about changing that status, taking our consulate out. removing our personnel. I have a team of people working for me on these issues. There's no discussion about reducing that or changing that. We recognize that there is a problem to be resolved, an ability for the United States to make a positive change, a positive movement forward, and we're committed to doing that. And we will work with the parties, with anybody who will work with us to help find solutions to the problems that are in front of us. And there will always be problems to be resolved, and we're going to continue working that with all these people up here. And I mean, we talked about Brexit and all these other issues. I mean, these are very difficult challenges. They are very hard. But I have to say, I've been extremely impressed throughout my whole career by the diplomats and the bureaucrats that I've worked with in Europe and all these countries. They have very creative approaches to these problems, very creative ways of working around the issues to expanding the context so that we can get to solutions. And I remain, because of that, very optimistic that I think the people we have up here on the stage and the others who are working this will be able to come up with solutions to what seem to be like intractable problems.
President Trump actually was asked, would he visit the border in Northern Ireland and St. Patrick's Day, and he said, yeah, he would be interested in, so that's a possibility. He would be interested in visiting. And Ian Paisley Jr. told me he's invited him to come and see the border as well. So you never know, there could be a...
His golf clubs.
Yeah, he's got a golf interest in the Republic. So anyway, it's a possibility. Okay, so moving on. Anyone else? Yeah, there. This gentleman there.
Hi, my name is Henry. I'm an undergrad here. My question is, you mentioned how young people and people my age, I'm only a few months older than the Good Friday Agreement, didn't grow up with any violence. But there's a lot of political frustration now. Do you worry that like young people who didn't know how bad it actually was might see violence as an option, and there might be a return to violence because of the political frustration?
No, I mean, what do you think?
Well, I have two children of my own who are now 27 and 24 who grew up without having any concept at all of what we euphemistically call the Troubles. And, you know, I'm very proud of that because, I mean, that their whole social life in Belfast is entirely different than mine would have been as a student all those years ago, where bombs were going off and everybody was searching into stores. So, I mean, I think that is, you know, a very good thing to have. I do think that, you know, the younger population particularly in Belfast is becoming more liberal, more outgoing. They're used to travelling more. They're used to seeing not only a lot more tourists coming in, but also, you know, if you look at the fabric of Northern Ireland society, and I was saying about the division between the two communities, but we have, you know, 40,000 Polish people now living in Northern Ireland, and leaving aside the whole Brexit issue. So the fabric of society is changing. I wouldn't ever think we were cosmopolitan. We're nowhere near Dublin in that respect, but we are changing. And I think that gives a vibrancy to young people. The problem with young people is, generally speaking, they don't vote. I don't know whether it's the same situation here in the United States, but it's very hard to get young people to go into the polling booth and you know, cast their vote. So their influence on the election is not actually, the elections isn't actually as strong as we would wish. But I do think that it is a good thing. I think that obviously they're now learning as a history project in schools, which is good. But I think generally speaking, it's probably better for society that you know, they're not constantly hearing about it, or they're not actually having to deal with it on a daily basis.
But I mean, I think it's what you were saying. Yeah, I was just going to say the point you made at the beginning about people being careless almost about the Good Friday Agreement. Oh, do we really need it? You're right. I don't think that reflects what most people think. I think people both in Britain and Ireland are very appreciative and are very aware of the benefits. But
this is a sort of, it's a very anecdotal comment, but I have a very good friend who's from Northern Ireland, and I remember we were all kind of sitting in a group with a group of friends, and we were having one of those conversations you have, talking about all the movies that you saw in your youth. And she said, I really can't take part in this conversation because, you know, I didn't go to the cinema. My parents were always very worried about sending me to a sort of public venue because of their fears about the security. And she would be the first to admit that, you know, that's on the scale of suffering, that's pretty limited, right? Not seeing Star Wars or E.T. or something. But it spoke to me about a wider point, which is just the way in which the Troubles prevented the kind of normality that every young person should have, even if it's of something as simple as being able to go and see the popular movies at the cinema. And I think that the fact that that is over is something that is, in my experience, really highly prized, and I'm optimistic that that people will retain the perspective that what they have now is so much better than the troubled period of the past.
Yeah. Do you want to come in there, Michael?
No, I think Roman is.
Yeah,
Mike
that's
said
fine.
it all, yeah.
Yes, just at the back there. Yeah.
Good afternoon. First of all, thanks to Georgetown for this great event. One of the things that I saw was really key to the Good Friday Agreement was, frankly, just democracy and the executive and politics. With the executive breaking down, I don't see any more politics in Northern Ireland, and what I worry about is a return to violence. People will say, look, we tried that, politics doesn't work. And a question for the British and Irish representatives, as guarantees of the Good Friday Belfast Accord, what are your governments doing? You've mentioned some great things here, but I don't see a lot of it in the press, a sense of outrage as to the current breakdown in Northern Ireland.
Well, I mean, obviously the negotiations are ongoing, and those negotiations involve the parties in Belfast, generally accompanied by senior ministers from our government and from the British government, who are there to help to, persuade, cajole, explain, etc. So those negotiations are ongoing, and they go through more intense cycles, and then whatever. So that's all ongoing, and it gets reported quite well back home, but I think maybe a bit more fitfully here. I mean, some of the changes with Northern Ireland were, of course, years ago, every major US newspaper had a correspondent based in Belfast and Dublin because it was such an interesting story, and of course that's all kind of faded away now. So you might not see it reported as much in the US media, but believe me, these efforts are definitely ongoing. I mean, as to the point about return to violence, I mean, while you could not, it would be unwise to completely discount it, but I think the amount of people who have tried to be active in a violent way since the Good Friday Agreement has been very, very small, and they have lacked any kind of support base in their wider community on both sides, either loyalists or dissident Republican groups. I do think, though, and something I think, again, if you're an executive, it needs to be looked at, I do think there's always a danger in people creating their own personal history or mythology. I always think of Daniel Patrick Moynihan's great line that you're entitled to your own opinions, but not your own facts. And I would always be a bit concerned, and it's a tendency in one particular party, in particular in Ireland, to romanticize a view about the Troubles, to turn it into some kind of heroic war. And I think that kind of idea can sometimes appeal to younger people who are disenfranchised and who feel that they missed out on some glorious opportunity to do something for Mother Ireland and so on. And I think that tendency is something that needs to be pushed back on, that not to allow people to create their own mythology, their own history, or to glorify what are in fact a terrible time for everybody involved. But as I say, I think the chances are of going back to violence are very slim. But again, the line nature abhors a vacuum. Far less likely if we had an up and running proper politics as we should have.
Michael, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I guess what I would maybe say is it's not that politics has stopped, it's that politics hasn't proved as productive as we would like in the recent past. It's a good challenge. What are the governments doing about it? They're doing what I described earlier. We're cajoling, we're encouraging, we're facilitating, we're doing our utmost to get the executive back up and running. Again, I'm kind of optimistic. I don't see this leading to a return to violence because of what we were talking about earlier, because I think the peace dividend, the benefits of peace in Northern Ireland are so visible in the economic space, in the inward investment, in the innovation, in the kind of cultural vitality that we've all spoken about. So, I'm relatively optimistic that the chances of a return to violence are slight, but I also think that that's not something we should ever be complacent about, which sort of brings me back to what I said in my first intervention, which is about the need to really make sure that we're committing and recommitting and preserving the Good Friday Agreement.
Okay, yeah, final word, because, go on.
I'm
You're-
sorry,
no, that's fine.
I was just going to say, when we've talked to the parties in Northern Ireland, and I think what we see now is the situation that's there makes good politics for the parties. They're very good at politics. They just haven't moved to governance, and that's where we need them to go, is to governance, not politics. And that's what we're hoping to achieve.
Yeah, okay. Okay, thank you very much. We'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much for your questions, Adrian.